Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the 5 pillars of enterprise-grade cloud management webinar. We're going to wait just a few more minutes to allow for a few more people to join in, and then we'll get started. In the meantime, I want to say that I hope that everyone had an awesome 4th of July weekend, and everyone outside of the US, I hope you just had a generally awesome weekend as well. I'll be joined today by Scalr CEO and founder Sebastian Stadel, who is sitting right here beside me wearing his signature red Scalr hoodie. But the funny thing is that you can't really tell apart where Sebastian ends and the red hoodie begins. You feeling the freedom there? Got severely sunburned in our company barbecue on 4th of July, and yeah, it looks like it's a bit challenging to move. Are you up to me grilling you about cloud management?
Yeah, this is Sebastian here. Yeah, it is quite painful. That sunburn was pretty deep.
Yeah, so it pretty much refutes my theory of you being a Targaryen. So I don't know how this will affect your claim to the throne, but we'll have to. I hope everyone is caught up on Game of Thrones. No spoilers here. But I do think the last 2 episodes were all-time TV show Hall of Famers, for sure. All right, so I think we're just about ready to get started. Have a nice turnout here. And okay, so just before we get started, I want to say that this webinar will be recorded, and after this webinar, we will be sharing a slide deck with some of the conclusions and information that that we will arrive at during this discussion, and you will get all of that plus more information about our next webinars to your inboxes. Okay, so first of all, my name is Ron. I'm Product Marketing Manager for Scalr, and joining me today, my guest is Sebastian Stadel, CEO and founder of Scalr.
Great to be here. Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time and kind of climbing from under the pile of sunburned ointment. And all right, so I say let's jump right into it. So today we're going to do something a little bit different from what we usually do on webinars or webinars in general. We're going to have a bit more of a discussion. Sebastian's been around in the cloud market in general and in the cloud management space specifically for quite a while. So he's seen different enterprises and different companies and how they do things and different technologies and different platforms and how they can be used and how different challenges can be approached and how the landscape looks like for different solutions. So I'm going to be asking him a few questions about the cloud management space, about how enterprises do what they do, and how they adopt cloud.
Yeah, interestingly, just for the hipster cred here, my AWS account was created back in 2004, before EC2 and before S3 was even around. Back when like Amazon only had the ECS, some e-commerce service before. Yeah.
So
you were a long time ago.
You were on AWS before it was cool.
Before it was cool. Yeah. Totally before it was cool.
So our general topics for today, and this is going to be pretty much a free-form discussion, but our general topics for today are the challenges enterprises face when they adopt cloud or when they adopt sort of a multi-cloud strategy, a brief overview of the cloud management space, the different solutions that you might find in it, or the different types of solutions that you might find in it. How does enterprise-grade cloud management look like? So basically, what are some of the approaches that today's enterprises take to take on these challenges? And finally, this is a Scalr webinar, so we will spend about 10 minutes talking about how Scalr fits in to all of this. You might notice that there's no Q&A bullet point there, and that is because we want this to be an open discussion. So please, at any point of the webinar, submit your questions in the GoToWebinar menu. Submit any question that you might have for me, for Sebastian, for the Scalr team about cloud management or about the product, about anything we might be talking about at that moment. And we will try to incorporate the answers to those questions to the discussion as we go along.
Sounds good.
Okay, so you ready?
Yeah, I am ready.
Get started? Okay, so our first topic is the challenges. So let's try to identify the problem, and then we can start talking about a solution. So when an enterprise adopts a multi-cloud strategy or tries to take on sort of a multi-cloud deployment or infrastructure, give me an example for some of the major challenges you've seen enterprises face.
So first of all, one of the things I noticed is that it rarely does an organization like wake up one day and decide like we need a strategy for this, and then start adopting cloud. It's usually the reverse, where like folks in the organization are already using cloud, they're already being successful with it, they already have things in production. And then before you know it, the organization is spending significant sums on the cloud, and it's at that point that they decide, hey, this was all organic until now. Let's try to be a little bit more proactive here, and let's try to have a strategy around it. And so as a result of that, one of the challenges I see is that there's tends to be very strong vendor lock-in. Because adoption of Amazon and others is organic, a lot of times the way it's adopted, it tends to be very closely tied into the particularities of how a cloud provider works. Which means that if it makes sense for you to move from Amazon to another provider, say Azure or Google, it becomes that much harder. So vendor lock-in, I would say, is kind of one of the things that emerge from that organic usage.
So the first point was sort of that it's usually not a strategy, and it's more like steering the ship. We see the ship going in a certain direction, and we're trying to make more sense out of it. So it's not so much as a strategy as something that happens, like multi-cloud will inevitably happen in the enterprise.
Yeah, and that's how it starts out. It's organic, and then eventually gets embraced. Yeah. And then, so it starts at the bottom of the organization, kind of goes up over time until such time as it gets embraced by executive management.
Yeah, and your second point was lock-in, which is interesting. I mean, so obviously you mentioned lock-in to things that are deeply integrated into the different cloud platforms, like making the move from AWS and then embracing another platform. But
yeah, so there's when my advice there is really that using some form of abstraction layer, whether it's an open source one or proprietary one, they're really useful. Not immediately, but it does pay dividends back over time when you do need to make that switch for whatever reasons.
Yeah, but that's I mean, coming from you. You are a vendor, essentially. So you talk about vendor lock-in, but you might want to lock people into something like Scalr.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So, like, essentially, I'm saying, hey, don't be locked into these guys. Be locked into us instead. Good point. So, I would actually like to separate to the, two types of lock-in. There's vendor lock-in, and then there's technology lock-in. Any choice you make will have degrees of lock-in in some manner, but I would argue that being locked into a vendor is dramatically worse than being locked into a technology, especially if it's an open source technology. Being locked into a vendor means you don't have any pricing control. Being locked into a technology, if it's open source, that's not that much of a big deal. So I would argue that of all the different kinds of lock-in, reducing, maybe not eliminating, but reducing vendor lock-in is probably the thing that you should strive for.
Okay. Which, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but which generally you can do, like you mentioned, through abstraction or through the use of open source tools, for example. Okay, so the vendor lock-in and sort of the emergence of a multi-cloud reality as opposed to a strategy, those are those are two of the first challenges.
So
What would you say is another major one?
So before we switch to the other major one, the reason you really want that is if the beginning of your cloud adoption is organic and then over time it kind of becomes embraced by the organization, that's when the organization has the opportunity to create a competitive situation for the vendors to bid. That's super important because like if you're ever going to be selling your house, or if you're ever going to be buying or selling anything, the best way you can get the best possible pricing is if you create a competitive situation. And if you're locked into one provider, there's just no way that you can create that competitive situation, which means you won't have that advantageous pricing that others might get. And if you're at small scale and you're spending not more than $100,000 a year on Amazon, it doesn't really matter. But when you start getting into the millions or tens of millions spent, that's headcounts. That's budget that you could allocate to headcount. So it becomes strategic for the organization.
Yeah. We have an interesting question about this, and I have actually heard a similar argument before. So if you truly want to avoid, the question reads like this: it seems that you have no use for all the vendors' specialized product. For example, the tons of different AWS products you have. You have your Redshift, and you have your Elastic Load Balancers, and you have all of your specific AWS products, for example. If you truly want to avoid vendor lock-in, is this even possible? And this is generally the argument is that we get the argument, okay, it sounds very good, we want to avoid vendor lock-in, but in order to do that, are we also sort of avoiding a lot of the actual benefits that we get out of the cloud? Isn't those services, are they not part of the thing that makes cloud as efficient or makes those promises?
Yeah, that's a very smart question. I would argue that lock-in is not a Boolean. It's more of a float, or it's more of something that's a grayscale. And you have to decide where you want to be on that kind of spectrum of no lock-in to all of the lock-in. So an example would be if you want to reduce all lock-in, then you just basically want to stick to the EC2 equivalent of getting a virtual machine, and then you don't leverage security groups, you don't ever leverage Elastic Load Balancers, you don't leverage any of those things. That's quite painful. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you just use everything that Amazon provides, then there's absolutely no way you'll be able to move. So there's somewhere in there that is a sweet spot that gives you enough reduced lock-in to be able to move from one vendor to another and create that competitive situation, but still not enough to kind of actually hurt you. And I would argue that things like the Elastic Load Balancer, things like Amazon RDS, are already available in other providers. Like there's on Google, there's Cloud SQL. There's on Google, there's a Google Compute Load Balancer. So there's a core set of specialized products that are being commoditized. And so I would argue that if you want to not avoid it, but if you want to reduce it, those would be acceptable additions on top of the just raw compute.
Yeah, and that ties into the point that you made before about eliminating lock-in versus reducing it, sort of finding that sweet spot in between.
Yeah, I have to say that all the major hyperscale vendors are all kind of commoditizing each other. So like Amazon came up with Lambda, now there's Google Cloud Functions. Microsoft is also coming up with their equivalent there. Amazon has the Elastic Container Service. Google has the Google Container Engine. So they're like over time they're all commoditizing it. So you kind of have to decide whether you want to be a little bit behind on the newest things to be able to get the commoditized versions, or not. So it kind of depends on where you want to be on that early adopter phase.
Okay. Let's take one more question, then kind of move on to the next topic. Just to clarify, the question is, when you refer to vendor, are you talking about multi-cloud environments such as AWS or Azure? Or I would assume that the other side of that, are you talking about a vendor like Scalr or one of the tools that you use for cloud management?
Yeah, so again, a really smart question from the audience. This is fantastic. I would say that the vendor you want to prioritize reducing that lock-in is the vendor you're spending the most money on. And so if
Which
you're
usually would be the platform.
yeah, and that usually would be the cloud platform. So as much as I would love for the highest the highest amount of money be spent on Scalr, in reality, like the Amazon's about an order of magnitude more expensive. And so when you look at it from that perspective, just kind of prioritizing by about what you're getting the most, what you're getting what you're spending the most on, that's the vendor you would want to abstract first.
That makes sense. Okay, so keep sending those great questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can as we move through it. Okay, so we were talking about the challenges, and I think we mentioned quite a few of them. We were talking about vendor lock-in and sort of grayscale of vendor lock-in. Let's talk a little bit about another one. What would you say is another major challenge to sort of a cloud strategy?
One challenge that's been cited a lot, but it bears repeating, which is kind of like spending more than you anticipated, and that happens for the simple reason that there's been a major change in how IT spend gets decided, and instead of that spend being decided kind of top down by finance that sets in IT budgets, and then that IT budget gets split up and divided between all the different groups that need resources. Now that's been flipped over, and now it's the developer, the application team that's in charge of their own budgets, and then all of that gets rolled up into the overall organizational spend. And when it happens like that, upper management doesn't have that visibility into what all the application teams are spending. And so when one team gets more is fortunate and is more successful than anticipated, they end up kind of spending more on infrastructure. But conversely, because there's a lot of risk for a developer to provision a machine that's too small versus getting one that's too big, developers tend to provision machines that are over the kind of actual usage, over capacity. And so the combination of not really having good visibility into what the organization is planning to spend, with the fact that at the bottom, from the grounds up, there's folks that have a tendency to provision bigger boxes than they need. The combination of those two things means that organizations routinely just blow out their budgets by 50 or 100%.
Which is interesting to me because I think we talked about this a little bit on the previous webinar, which was about cost management that I did with Dan. We talked a little bit about this, that for at least for some of the companies that we work with or the customers, the pain that they would describe when talking about the data center days, which are still a thing, it's still the data centers obviously still exist, is that capacity planning is very challenging, and over provisioning is just a reality that you have to deal with, and eventually finance is being presented just with a big sum of money that represents this is how much we're spending on infrastructure, instead of having that deeper visibility, like you mentioned. And now it seems that in a lot of the cases, we sort of arrive at the same challenge where a developer feels more comfortable to say, okay, I'm going to over-provision a machine. I'm going to provision a machine that's too big because that has less operational risk in it than provisioning a machine that's too small.
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way. If I provision a 2-core, 4 gig or 8 gig server, and then I install a Zookeeper on it or something like that, and if Java likes to gobble up memory, so if my application crashes at some point in time, and that crashes because there's not enough memory on that machine, then that's that's time I've lost, versus not a lot of money saved for the organization by getting an 8 gig versus something larger. So that's what I meant by there's a natural and rational tendency to over-provision machines.
Yeah, and I think the sort of the other side of that, or another that might cause another challenge or another factor, which be sort of a general hindrance in organizational productivity. Not necessarily just the developer, but I see all these different things as tied to one another, as connected to one another. So the fact that the developer might over-provision, under-provision, overspend, underspend, all of those things, they might result in sort of a hindrance in productivity, a hindered productivity, not just for one department or not for just for one constituency, but for several.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, so let's take a look at a few more of these questions. Okay, so we have a question. Many vendors are now asserting capabilities to migrate from cloud to cloud. Do you think services like Elastic Load Balancer will easily be transferred?
That's a pretty tough question, and I think it's a good one. When you when you say migrating, when somebody talks about migrating from one cloud to another, it's important to define what that migration experience should look like. Things like live migration are very difficult, especially from one cloud provider to another, and I don't think anybody really claims to be able to do that for any type of application under any circumstance. So oftentimes, what's meant by migration is something like redeployments, where you have an application, you shut it down from Amazon, and then you redeploy that on Azure. And so if you look at things from the perspective of redeploying, that's a much easier problem to solve, because when you're redeploying, then a lot of the structure of the recipients of your load. So if you have like an Elastic Load Balancer in front of some Docker containers or in front of some application servers, then you can tear that down and then spin that back up on Azure, and then just use the Azure load balancing service. And there's not a lot of stuff in those load balancing services that can't be that can't be recreated from one service to another. They're fairly well commoditized. What gets more tricky when you want to migrate is always the data, and depending on the amount of data you have, it's often called data gravity. So the more data you have, the harder it is to actually migrate. And but if you want to do something, so that's the first case. In case where you want to redeploy, in the case where you want to do like a live switchover, that's where things like the Elastic Load Balancer are harder to use because it's not possible to have those balance across cloud providers. So that's when you would want to use something like Nginx or HA proxy. That's when you want to take control of your own load balancing, and that gets tricky.
Okay. So I do want to take we have one more Scalr specific questions. We do have some time for that reserved for the end of the webinar, but I just want to make sure we don't skip over that.
Didn't you say that we were supposed to keep this conversational?
Well,
no, yeah.
Yeah, so I just at least want to read it out loud to make sure that that we don't skip it. So we have a question here that says, if I were to invest in Scalr, must I maintain teams to add new cloud provider features, or does Scalr maintain teams to make the adds and adjustments? So if you could briefly answer that, and we can expand upon it a bit later.
So one of the things, so I don't want to get too much into Scalr, and I want to keep this kind of a generic conversation. But we recently released the capability to manage your RDS servers and your Elastic Load Balancers inside of Scalr as what we call cloud services. So that was the result of a major refactoring we did, which is going to allow us to add a lot more cloud provider kind of cloud services over time, such as the Elastic Container Service, maybe Lambda, depending on what customers ask for. So the engineering teams that we have at Scalr are actually working on adding those new cloud provider features, and that's a fairly large area of investment for us right now.
Okay. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so let's move things along here. We've been talking about the different challenges the enterprises faced. We mentioned lock-in. We mentioned hindered organizational productivity due to all these different reasons that we mentioned. I would say another one, we mentioned all these different constituencies in the enterprise, so another challenge might be actually getting buy-in for all these from all these different groups. So for example, maybe the security team needs a certain thing and the finance team needs a certain thing. The DevOps or the IT, whoever owns cloud might want things to go a certain way or enforce a certain type of policy. And the development teams themselves, they just want to make an API call and get back some resources.
Yeah,
so
that's a really good point. That in a large organization, like in typical enterprise, all the functions are siloed or they're compartmentalized. So you have like the security team, you have the networking team, you have the you might have a storage team, then you have the application development team, and they all want to optimize to make their own jobs easier, which is totally understandable. And as a result of that, so of everybody kind of wanting to optimize to make their own use cases easier, it ends up kind of having a pretty unoptimal overall solution. Whereas what the organization actually wants is something that's going to be like a global maximum. And so to do that, you need to get everybody to compromise some so that the overall organization it just works better. And if there's any single constituency inside of the organization that's just more powerful, then that's kind of a lot of times that's the source of a lot of problems. So something I've seen in some organizations where the developer groups are very powerful. As a result of that, the security has very little say in it. Finance can't get their jobs done. The networking and storage teams kind of are disenfranchised. So anytime you have that, like a particular group that's more powerful than others, it becomes hard to coordinate. And as a result of that, you get security and compliance requirements that are just not met. And that's where it gets really painful. Like you have a developer group that goes out to the cloud and they build their application and they do that on their own timeline. And their time to market is remarkably fast. But as a result of that, they might have skipped the step of checking with security or reviewing things with the compliance officer. And so that becomes risky at the scale of an organization where any application that's public facing becomes a vector of attack into the organization. So there's kind of a trade-off there between getting to market really, really fast and making sure that you've got a good process so that the things that you do release are secure and don't compromise the organization.
It's interesting that you mentioned the speed to market as a factor in all of this. So basically, something that was interesting to me that I heard one of our customers say, where obviously we were trying to be very impressive about how awesome Scalr is and all that, and one of the things that you put on collateral is speed to market. It gets you can get your solutions out there faster, and their response was simply, yes, that's not Scalr, right? Or that's not the cloud management platform. That's not the tool. Cloud is fast. That's not news, right? That's not something that. I mean, it might be impressive, but that's not the benefit. The benefit is being able to do that while sort of balancing all these different plates, one on your hand, one on your hand, one on your head, two on your feet, or whatever. Balancing all these different challenges and issues between all the constituencies that you mentioned. So to kind of wrap up this section about the challenges, do you want to give a quick example of an enterprise that had to deal with some of these issues, or something that you personally had experience with?
Yeah, I think the conglomerate behind USA Today called Gannett is a good example of that, where by their own words, there's a lot more to deploying an application than just launching a virtual machine and putting Apache on it, and so. In the case of this news conglomerate, the organization generally is cost conscientious, and so the finance team needed to be needed to have a voice and be able to predict cash flows and budget things. The security team needed to make sure that all the newspapers and all the media properties that they have, don't get defaced and hacked. And so there's this whole workflow of reviews that they needed to automate. They needed to get the security teams to automate their work. They needed to get the compliance teams. They needed, as a kind of a publicly traded company, they're Sarbanes-Oxley compliant. So they had to have all these controls, and all of those controls needed to be optimized and automated for them to truly be able to be agile and deploy things quickly. And being able to get infrastructure quickly was just a tiny portion of the overall effort to automate the entire workflow. So I think they've done Frank and Eric over there have done a fantastic job modernizing how Gannett does infrastructure.
Yep, that is a very interesting use case. I just want to say before we move on to our next topic that we've been getting a lot of great questions, and we have them all logged right here. All of the very Scalr specific questions, we're going to get to those. We're going to do like a rapid fire lightning round at the end of this when we talk more about Scalr specifically. So make sure you stick around, and we'll get to all of those questions in just a little bit at the top of the hour. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good handle on the different challenges that an enterprise might face going into this, or more likely already into cloud usage in some capacity. The next thing I wanted to ask you about was some of the approaches to solutions that enterprise take.
Yep.
So I think that generally the different tools out there, or the different types of tools out there, will roughly represent the different approaches to solving problems, basically, to solving the challenges that we just mentioned. So could you give us a brief overview of how you see this cloud management space, or the landscape of the space that we're in, of tools that help you optimize or manage your cloud usage?
Yeah, I think my math background is kind of leaking a little bit through here. I talked about a global maxim earlier, but basically there's two approaches to cloud management, and the first one is to when you run into a problem, get a solution that solves just that one problem, and then move on. And then there's the other approach, which is to get a general platform that's going to help the entire organization be more successful. And both are valid, but from my perspective, if every time you run into a problem, you solve just that one finite problem, you tend to end up with a local maximum and not a global maximum. So what that means is you end up with having to spend a lot of time integrating between all the different products that you've bought. And although there's like excellent point problems for each one of those, like I'm thinking about Packer for deploying images across multiple clouds. I'm thinking about Cloudin for managing your costs across Azure and Amazon and Google. Although all of these are excellent point solutions, you end up having to spend a lot of time integrating all of these into a common workflow and kind of making sure that you're translating the objects from one to the other and taking all this into account. And because they're all supplied by different vendors, a lot of times the mapping becomes problematic. So an example of that would be if you're using Packer to build an image somewhere, and that's going to create storage, you won't have the tools to be able to, like Packer won't have any sort of integration to Cloudin to be able to account for the cost of that AMI that you've just deployed. And so that becomes a challenge because of that lack of integration. So to kind of sum up my point here is there's two approaches to cloud management. One is kind of on the point-based solution, and the other one is the general platform.
So basically, like a lot of different problems, it would be, one approach would be the more surgical approach.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
That would be, I need to solve this one specific thing very well, and then you might have a tool that does one thing or a few things very, very well. And the other approach will be a bit more inclusive, and will have a bit more of that balance that we mentioned earlier. Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting. I think that now that we talked a little bit about the approaches to these solutions, and we talked a little about the challenges that those different solutions try to solve. A lot of the times what we end up with and what we believe in and sort of strive towards is really building that enterprise grade solution to be able to solve these different challenges. Because the challenges that we mentioned are not necessarily the challenges you will find in an SMB, are not necessarily the challenges you will find in a startup. There are definitely some of the same challenges. Definitely there's overlap there. But the sort of list that we went through, that's usually what we see in these large enterprises, like you gave the example of Gannett. So that sort of led us to say, like, okay, then what would be the enterprise grade solution to those challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really characterizes something that's enterprise grade is how does it scale to hundreds or thousands of users? How does it scale to hundreds or thousands of machines, if not tens of thousands? And as an example, there's some cloud management tools out there that when you want to launch a virtual machine, it makes you choose your AMI from a drop-down. That's ridiculous, right? Because if you have if you're in a virtualization world, and you have like 4 templates to deploy from, then a drop-down is fine. You choose from the drop-down what version of RHEL you want to use. But on the cloud, it makes no sense. Because you're going to click on that drop-down, you're going to have a list of 500 AMIs to choose from, if not more. And there's no search inside of that, and you're going to have to scroll through that drop-down. So what I'm saying here is when you're building your cloud management software, whether you're building it yourself or you want to buy some off the shelf or use an open source one, some of the telltale signs of whether it's built for the enterprise or not can be seen in just kind of the user interface and how it exposes choice to you.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned, which is something that I want to get your opinion on. You just mentioned open source there. Whether you want to go open source, whether you want to go DIY, or whether you want to go something that is fully commercial. So that is an argument that I've heard before. That an enterprise, and we talked a little bit about this just earlier today, that going open source might be an answer to something like vendor lock-in. Why do you think open source has an effect on cloud management solution being enterprise grade?
Well, I mean, at this point, I would argue that it's open source is just the way you build software these days.
That's a powerful statement.
Yeah, but
you're going to be quoted on that one.
but I do stand by that comment too. You can see whether it's Docker, you can see whether it's MongoDB or Cassandra, you can see whether it's Cloud Foundry or Kubernetes or Mesos, even the good folks at Mesosphere open source DCOS, whereas that originally was proprietary. Like all the great software out there is open source. It's all community built. We're now 2 decades into the open source revolution, and that's just how you build great software. It's collaborative. You work with the community. The community suggests features. The community spots bugs. The community submits pull requests, and as a result of all that, you just have better software. And so my point here is that when you're really looking at some of the absolute best software out there in the world, it really open source really is the way to go for that.
And I think that you mentioned how being open source might make the software itself better, or how it might help reduce vendor lock-in. But recently, I actually saw another application to this that that came from the community as opposed to us, which is that compliance and security argument of if it's open source, the code is auditable. The code is open. You can look at
that's a good point. For organizations that are super security conscious, and again, ties back to what we were saying on enterprise grade. If you're if you're a small organization, then if you're a startup, then you basically, if you get hacked into, then you're not as much of a target as if you're, say, one of the big 5 banks on the East Coast. So the larger the organization is, the more frequently it gets attacked, until the point where some of the very largest organizations in the world get attacked just all the time. It's really important for that code to be auditable, so that you have lots of eyeballs over it, so that when you deploy that open source solution in your organization, you're benefiting from all the other community members and all the other organizations that are also taking a look at what's being done. And so open source just produces more secure software. And that's super important for anything to be considered enterprise grade.
Better, stronger, taller, faster.
Pretty short, so I'm not sure taller. But
So yeah, just yesterday, I don't know if any of you have watched the Pixar movie Inside Out, but just yesterday our CTO mentioned that Sebastian currently looks like the emotion anger, which is short and red with hair that's basically flame.
Yeah, I'm actually really blending into my hoodie right now.
Yeah. And I'm going to lose my job after this webinar. So two other things that I talked about with Dan on the last webinar that I want to get your take on, and how that relates into a piece of software being enterprise grade, is the enforcement of policy and different approaches to enforcing that. Because we talked a lot about whether it be like a financial policy or a security policy, or some sort of guardrail that lets the developer know what they should provision. So the general conclusion that we arrived at is that the two general approaches would be preventative controls versus reactive controls.
Yeah.
The argument that we kind of had is which is better, which do you need? And the second part of that is how do you enforce that? So I want to get your take on how does that relate to being enterprise grade?
Yeah, so I would disagree with you a little bit. I don't think you want either preventative controls or reactive controls. I think most large organizations are going to want both, or going to need both, actually. The reason behind that is there's some changes that are reversible. And the changes that are reversible, those you can have reactive policies on it. And those are great because they allow you a lot more flexibility. They allow you to kind of move at your own pace, and then if you're making a mistake, then it gets reversed for you. So an example of that would be you deploy some infrastructure with a security group that opens up port 22 to the world. You can have a security group, a reactive policy that sees that and then automatically changes the security rules in that security group so that that those machines are only accessible from like office IP addresses. So those are changes that are reversible, and they're fine. But there's also a lot of changes that are not reversible. And so those you typically want to have preventative controls. So for example, if you provision a machine that's those huge new ones from Amazon, the X1, that cost something like $10,000 a month. If you provision one of those and you forget about it, that's you can't reverse that charge. So in a kind of a dev test environment, you might want to have a preventative policy that prevents folks from deploying anything that's more than a couple $100 a month. Mm-hmm. And so any organization is also going to have some high trust individuals, like the office of the CTO type folks, and they're also going to have the standard teams, and they have various levels of seniority, various levels of understanding of how security works, and how how to defend against the attackers. And so because of that, you're going to want to have a different set of tools to be able to secure the organization, whether you want to apply some of those preventative policies or the reactive ones. So the point here being that that for any cloud management, I would consider for that to be enterprise grade, needs to offer the users a combination of both preventative and reactive controls to be able to secure the organization based on the types of users.
Yeah, because just like we mentioned, the different tools that you might have in the cloud management space, it's very, very scenario based. It's very based on what is the problem that you're trying to solve and using the appropriate tool for it or the appropriate solution for it. And as far as enforcing those, you mentioned different levels of trust, which might be something, might be a word that I don't think you'll hear being used too much at the actual enterprises, because it might cause, do they trust this guy more than they trust me?
Yeah.
But the reality is that the office of the CDO will have different privileges than a developer that just started yesterday.
Yep.
And there's also, it's more likely for that new developer to mess something up than the person who has been working for 3 years in the office of the CTO. That's just reality. That's the truth. So you need, and also if someone new gets promoted, let's say from a dev team to the office of the CTO to something, you need to be able to pretty easily remove them from one environment that has a certain set of privileges and permissions and put them into that new one.
Mm-hmm.
So very individualistic way of enforcing policy, I would say, wouldn't scale. Or if you tie, for example, that policy into an application, into a stack that says, whenever I provision this application stack, I want these this set of policies to go along with it. So that, for example, might work for a very small scale.
Yeah, I would say that's actually a really good point. You can use policies to make your team more productive. You can use policies to set up defaults. You can use policies to establish those guardrails.
Yeah.
That's just going to make the developer experience better. For example, if you have like 3 different VPCs on Amazon, and they're of various levels of security and various levels of access, it's not a great developer experience to force your developer to, every time they want to provision some infrastructure, to kind of go to some internal intranet and figure out, all right, this VPC ID here is what I should be using for development, and this other one here is what I should be using for for this other system. So being able to set a policy that just restricts them and places all workloads in one default VPC,
mm-hmm.
that just makes it easier for the developer. So you're increasing their productivity that way.
Yeah, and so basically a top-down approach, you would say, to sort of enforce these policies in a hierarchical way from the top down, where it's not just enforced on an individual, it's enforced maybe on a team or an environment from a higher level of trust into a lower level.
I think that would be a third pillar. So the first one kind of being that open source nature, and the second one being the preventative and reactive.
Yeah.
I think a third pillar would be that in a very large organization, you just need some sort of hierarchy to be able to define your policies. If you're a large bank, for example, you might have your investment bankers and your corporate bankers and commercial bankers. You might all have those kind of business units within the organization might have their own data retention periods. They might have their own policies for various things. And so the only way you can scale that policy enforcement and make it manageable at the size of a very large organization is by defining policies in a hierarchical manner, so that they get enforced top down. That's really the only way that it works. And then once you have that top down policy enforcement that's made in a hierarchical manner, you also want that engine, the policy engine, to produce policy adherence reports. And I think this is the really important one for kind of any cloud management, enterprise-grade cloud management. So here's an example. Let's say you have a policy that says every resource you have needs to be tagged with the user that provisioned that resource, the importance of it, whether it's development, production, whether it can be nuked, or whether it needs to be carefully cared for, and maybe a third one, like what business unit they're working on. But let's say that you want to change that policy and you want to add one more tag, and so you're going from 3 tags to 4 tags. Now you just make that change to the policy. So what happens is all your existing infrastructure is now out of compliance. It is no longer adhering to that policy.
Yeah.
So as a result of that, you need your cloud management software to be able to produce a report that says, these are all of the resources I have, this is all I have that's out of bounds with my policy. Mm-hmm. And this allows you to come up with a plan to bring everything back into compliance so that you can adhere to all those policies. So in an example, you've got 100 machines. Each one of those machines has 3 tags, and you change the policy for it to be 4 tags. Now it's going to tell you you've got 100 machines that need that 1 additional tag. And then your cloud management software is going to help you remediate that and kind of by giving you a workflow that's going to go out and kind of tag that with that 4th tag.
Yeah. And just to be fully transparent here, as far as I know, the policy adherence report is not something that that is currently available in Scalr.
No, right? That's correct. And what I'm talking about here are the things that you really need from your cloud management software, for it to work in a large enterprise. Mm-hmm. And this is the direction that Scalr is going in. But a lot of the things that we're talking about are what you need for cloud management to be truly enterprise grade, whether it's in Scalr or not.
Okay, so I want to take just a quick minute to sort of summarize some of the things that we were talking about. I think that while I do that, Sebastian, you might want to take a look at some of the questions that we got, and then we'll answer some of the Scalr-specific questions, and I think we'll just replace our last section of talking about how great Scalr is with just answering questions about them, because that will, I think, serve a better purpose. Okay, so basically, we called this webinar the 5 pillars of enterprise-grade cloud management. So let's quickly run through them, and then we'll get to the question.
Yeah, we didn't really have a time to kind of go through all of them, but I guess we can kind of cover them quickly now.
Yeah, I think most of them we at least touched on or mentioned, but obviously we can do a whole hour on each of these points. But as we see it, enterprise-grade cloud management solution, I would say the goal for it, or maybe the overarching goal for it, is to standardize the IT process, because that would be how you get that balance. We mentioned earlier, maybe the developer wants a Heroku class type of solution where they make a simple call, they get back the resources, and there's not a lot of friction there. But that doesn't work for finance. For finance, maybe that's kind of going rogue because they don't see the exact charge for it. Or maybe that presents another security issue, like we also have layer security and compliance in there.
I would actually argue as well that in today's large organization, like you just see ask any large organization if they have any monitoring solutions. Chances are they don't have 1, they have 30.
Yeah.
And if you ask them do you use NetApp or do you use MC, they're going to tell you they use both.
So the answer will be yes.
Yeah. So today's organization is extremely heterogeneous, and there's always a very significant effort to standardize technologies that are being used, to standardize the IT process. And I think one of the very important pillars of cloud management software is it needs to help you drive those standards in process, standards in cloud usage, etc.
Yeah. So standardizing IT process I see as the umbrella for all of this. The second one was controlling costs, yep. And that is, of course, how you and like we mentioned earlier, this will not just be setting the budget, or this will not just be taking a look at a report that shows you a certain thing, how much you spend on one thing. Making sure that the developer always provisions the right size of machine, for example, like the example that you mentioned, or something like, for example, we have a community member that had that basically had a policy that says Every night at around 8 p.m., all the machines shut down, and then all the dev stacks shut down, and then they power back up in 6 a.m. the following morning.
So that the machine having a policy that says all the dev machines only are only up during business hours.
Yeah, for example. So that will also have a direct impact on controlling costs.
Yep.
So it's visibility, but it's also
visibility and control.
Yeah, visibility and control. It's being able to take a look at everything, but also integrating those policies into the actual cloud usage workflow. The third one was accelerating organizational productivity, which I think is a byproduct of all the different ones that we've been mentioning.
Yeah, but the point was, we talked about that earlier, which is when you need to kind of find that global maximum, you need to find something that's going to work for everybody in the organization, as opposed to kind of picking your favorite and saying that these are the folks in the organization that are important and everybody else doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So optimizing for overall organizational productivities is important.
It could be solving 80% of everybody's problems as opposed to solving 100% of just a single problem.
Yeah, exactly.
The fourth one was layer security and compliance.
Yeah, and I think that's the larger the risk of the organization, the more sensitive data you have, the more important that becomes. And whether it's regardless of what approach you take, being able to layer that in a kind of hierarchical top-down manner is super important to protect the organization from threats.
And finally, we have reducing vendor lock-in, which I think we spend a lot of time talking to at the top of the hour through auditable code and open source software. So basically, not eliminating vendor lock-in completely is not completely realistic, but reducing it. Okay, so we kind of ran through that so we could get to the questions. It's the interesting part. We're going to do sort of a lightning round with these. Okay, so these are some of the Scalr specific questions we got. Does Scalr help me manage Cloud Foundry deployments, whether PCF or Bluemix or CF open source on AWS?
So we actually have a couple customers that are using Scalr to manage the machines and resources that Cloud Foundry runs on. So if Bluemix works the same, and basically the separation of responsibilities is in that case Cloud Foundry does application orchestration, and then Scalr does all the resource orchestration, and so you've got a nice clean separation, and Scalr is then used by the operators, like all the IT development, IT pros and kind of tech ops. And then all the application developers the interface through Cloud Foundry. So Scalr very much helps you deploy your Cloud Foundry. And there's that community member, that customer that's using Scalr for managing Cloud Foundry. They go even beyond that, and they use Scalr to offer services to the Cloud Foundry users. So, for example, if you want to stand up a RabbitMQ cluster, if you want to stand up a MySQL cluster, if you want to stand up Redis or Mongo, Scalr can help you do that and then expose those as services to Cloud Foundry. So Scalr is actually a really, really good solution to manage your Cloud Foundry deployments.
Okay, so another question which I think will probably warrant a larger discussion than just a yes or no answer, but we'll do our best to answer it briefly.
Answer will be maybe.
Yeah, definitely maybe. Microservices are a part of a larger shift in IT departments towards a DevOps culture, in which development and operations teams work closely together to support an application over its life cycle. Would Scalr help in this situation?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I generally don't like increasing scope on things, but in this case here, I think it warrants it. Which is there's a general trend for today's infrastructure to whereas back in 2006 through 2010, it was all about kind of EC2 and running virtual machines. Now it's gotten more heterogeneous, where today's organization is going to run maybe the data tier on either some physical or virtual machines, and then the application tier might be scheduled as containers on some sort of a Mesos or Kubernetes or something like that. And then in addition to that, you might have some cloud services, you might have like Elasticache for your caching tier. You might have like leverage the Elastic Load Balancer or maybe Amazon Lambda. And so today's applications and today's kind of DevOps, like the DevOps engineer that's kind of pushing the limits and kind of building newer architectures are using a wider set of tools. So specifically for that, inside of Scalr, you now have the ability to define what we call cloud services and include that inside of what we call a farm. And the goal of that farm is to have all of the configuration for all the infrastructure that's in service of that application. So regardless of whether it's containers, regardless if it's containers that's part of a microservice, whether it's part of your cloud service or your virtual machine, your physical machines, the farm is kind of that one thing that encompasses all of your resources. So in response to the question here, when you want to start deploying your microservices, you typically deploy that your stateless tier, those microservices on, say, Kubernetes. Those Kubernetes would be declared inside of Scalr, inside of your farm, and then you'd supplement those microservices with the data tiers, the network tiers, as other components in that farm.
So long answer.
Yeah,
everything you said. Short answer, yes.
Yeah, that was a long answer.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. So I think we're at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, I do want to say that everyone else that asked a question, we will be getting back to you over email with an answer to those questions, and we will be putting together a slide deck with a summary of everything we talked about, and we'll try to include some of those.
It's a pity we had a really good one on on-premises systems, but
Um,
we'll answer that.
maybe we can squeeze in a few more minutes if.
We'll get the 30-second version.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, how about VMware/Hyper-V on-prem systems, or for hybrid cloud, or are you in cloud only? I like the approach on this.
Yeah, I think I've changed a little bit my position over the last year or so on that. And initially, Scalr was only for the hyperscale cloud providers, and we actually have a few initiatives now to support VMware, to support all the on-premises systems, with the goal being we want to help organizations have a single pane of glass for all of their infrastructure, whether it spans the on-premise systems to kind of the next generation microservices, and help that organization standardize those IT processes and modernize their organization across multiple generations of how you do infrastructure. Oof, that was 30 seconds.
Nice. Okay, so I just want to mention that for anyone that has any more questions that you want to send our way, ron@scalr.com. Please feel free to contact me directly with any feedback that you might have had, what you liked about this format for the webinar or didn't like. We're always happy to hear those, or any. Yeah, or any questions, whether it be on the cloud landscape in general or Scalr specifically. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today, and you will soon get the recording to your inboxes with some more information on some of the upcoming content that we have in the pipeline. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.